This quote captures a simple but very real fact. As many youth workers know, oftentimes the basis for harmful actions by youth arises in the individual's own experience of pain. Those who've been harmed often respond by inflicting pain on others. This pain can arise from many sources, which range from direct encounters with others who cause them harm, or who bully them, or neglect them emotionally. This can arise in the family, or with peers, or in the school. However, I would also point to the pain and harm that arises through other sources that are found in less immediate but no less powerful dynamics. These are the societal dynamics, some of which are material and concrete, such as poverty and the absence of opportunities that others experience, which exclude them from developing their full potential. Others are the isms, such as sexism and racism and ableism, that label others in ways that lead to their stigmatization and exclusion from the opportunities many enjoy. Regardless of the source of the pain, it often leads to causing pain to others. A quick look at the criminal justice system provides insight into how issues are defined and what sorts of rules and solutions are created or not. It starts with the fact that it is a criminal system. Therefore, what is brought under its view are actions that are defined as criminal. This is achieved by having a set of laws that define actions as criminal. This means then that actions are then considered to be breaches of the law and acts against the state. What is sought then through the asking of certain questions is to establish what, how, and who did what. Therefore, all efforts are directed towards the person who is deemed to have caused the offense, the offender. This narrows the focus on essentially the one person who is labeled in a particular way who, while innocent until proven guilty, is under the pressure of the state who assumes, through prosecution, that they are guilty. Therefore, what is created is an adversarial system. This becomes a win-lose proposition, which leads to actions by both the prosecution and defense to be directed towards one or other of these ends. Truth-telling can become a pawn in this type of restricted discourse. To manage the system, various and extensive rules and procedures are established to frame what is allowed and what is and is not allowed as evidence and words. The focus does not look into causes and the reasons why, nor towards solutions directed to root causes. There is no role for the community other than to watch silently, and even more essential, no real voice for the person who's been harmed, the victim. By comparison, there are elements of the restorative justice paradigm that highlight the difference to the criminal justice paradigm. There are a number of key words that frame this paradigm: restore, relationships, inclusion, victims, harm doer, community. The end goals of repair, reconcile, and reassure are paramount. These words roll off the tongue in a way that gives meaning and humanity to events and actions that occur between people that need attention and redress. In fact, actions that cause harm and pain to others or have other negative impacts are events between persons first and only secondarily defined by the state and its laws. When the term harm is used, it needs to be thought of in both a broad sense and in a relational context. When a 16-year-old employee is charged with theft under $5,000 at a large retail outlet, it is also a breach of the trust placed in them, as well as an assault on the various relationships in their life. It impacts their work relationships, it impacts their sibling relationships, their relationships on their parents, and also their relationship to themselves. What needs to be repaired and restored are the stolen dollars, their relationships, and also her own sense of self and dignity in the here and now and for the future. Of central importance is the voice of those who've been harmed, or as we label them, victims. Store owners, neighbors, family members, or peers are afforded a voice in a restorative context. In fact, this is the cornerstone of restorative conversations that are effective. This quote highlights the critical difference in the two paradigms of justice. Criminal justice is about the offender, whereas a restorative paradigm begins with the experience, needs, and voices of those who've been harmed. These are very different starting points. Where you start in anything will dictate where you will go, what path you will take, and who will be on that journey. Victims are left out of the criminal justice system. In fact, many are re-victimized. Restorative justice restores the rights, the voice, addresses the needs, and gives victims their dignity back. This slide places the two paradigms side by side as a quick snapshot of the respective differences. Differences are captured in the initial questions and framing of actions. The restorative questions ask about who's been harmed, what are their needs, and who is responsible. Harmful actions are violations of relationships and the vital connections between people, their families, peer groups, and communities. The identification of needs drives both the process and the reparative and restorative solutions. It is not a process that is preset and dictates only a restricted range of possibilities. It is conversational, organic, and requires dialogue, which is oftentimes intense and quite emotional. Another way of capturing the difference in the two paradigms was framed by the Norwegian criminologist and abolitionist Niels Christie. In a framing piece he wrote in the 70s, he posed this notion. He said that we need to see conflict as property. If we accept this idea, then the next point is, who owns conflict in our modern world? Under the criminal justice paradigm, conflicts are effectively taken out of the hands of those whose conflict it belongs to. In the restorative paradigm, conflict is left in the hands of those to whom the conflict belongs. If one wants to build and nurture relationships and community, the restorative paradigm provides the principles and practices to support people making their way through the most difficult encounters that predictably arise between and amongst individuals and groups. While there is some debate over the origins of restorative practices, I think it is best summed up as a practice that has been renewed in modern times based on traditions that have deep roots in diverse sources. It is rooted in Indigenous practices as a reflection of their core worldview and values. This is found in North American Indigenous and First Nations peoples. It was reflected in the experience of the Maori peoples of New Zealand in the 1980s, through the racial discrimination they experienced in both child welfare and the justice systems, which led to major legislative changes in both domains. In addition, the restorative worldview is reflected in what has been referred to as traditional communities, with various examples from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and various African societies and countries. There are also distinctive faith-based roots, Christian, Buddhist, which espouse what can be named as restorative. And for our own current understanding, there are significant milestones in the Canadian colonial settler context. The next few slides will look at what I call the drivers of practice that make up restorative justice. They are what underlie the practice and supports its effectiveness and wide-ranging applicability beyond just the justice context. So let's look at each one of them briefly. This graphic illustrates the practice domains of what is called the social discipline window. This is a way of looking at the interrelationships between power, control, expectations, and relationships. Several Canadian practitioners, as I do, emphasize the relational and human rights dimensions of each window. When you're using the 2 quadrant, the focus is on power and rules. Youth experience being overpowered and done to. There's no experience of a relationship. 4 occurs when individuals do for others, often out of caring, but with no emphasis on expectations and responsibility. This robs youth of the opportunity to experience and grow from the consequences and impacts of their own actions and adversity. Not reflects various positions of neglect and ignoring. No power is exercised, no expectations communicated, and no relationship exists. With is a restorative window. It is demonstrated as highly relational and high on expectations, a belief in the potential and capacity of youth, while being high on accountability and responsibility. It also sees youth as equal rights-bearing individuals with a voice. It is the most powerful of the four in an authentic sense. This is a continuum of practice that moves from the everyday to the more formal justice applications. What this reveals and points to is the broader opportunity to incorporate the restorative principles and practices as a basis for effective youth work. Starting with what are called affective statements and questions, think of emotional intelligence. Using them can enhance the youth's capacity to be more capable and competent in relation to their emotions and those of others. This is a source of empathy. Regular youth workers need to intervene in the life space of youth with impromptu meetings. Early problem solving, which is informal and on the spot, can de-escalate conflicts. Circles are the ideal tool to address support, provide developmental and leadership opportunities for youth, and to address the more serious adversity and trauma in youth lives. Circles are great because they expand to fit around the situations in youth lives. However, what is important to note here is that getting to a conference or circle is often work where youth workers need to build up both the esteem, confidence, and competence of both those who have caused harm or have been harmed in order to participate in circles and especially in formal conferences. Having a continuum allows youth workers to be more strategic and respond to the moment more effectively. To get a sense of why these seemingly straightforward questions can have positive impact, experiment for a moment. I would suggest sitting down with another person and have a conversation with them about a recent incident where there were negative impacts to test out the effect of using these questions. You can start with an incident where they've caused negative impacts to another person. Now you've done that, let me explain the thinking and strategy behind the questions. The first question is simply a fact-based question, not asking why, pointing fingers, or anything that conveys judgment or accusations. The next two questions move to the thinking and cognitive realm. Many times when you ask a young person the first thinking question, they will say, "But I wasn't." Often true. So the second question allows for second thoughts and reflections. The next ones are what I call the look up and around questions. The focus moves to who has been affected, and then encouraging some insight and maybe empathy as to how they were affected. The last question is about making it right. It is solution focused and a forward thinking idea. No blame, no shame. The other side of a restorative conversation involves those who've been harmed. For those who've been harmed, the questions have a similar starting point, but focus more on their initial thoughts. Next, you ask about the impacts, which can be wide-ranging and include others. You may want to amplify this question to ensure their focus covers both themselves and those close to them. The last questions follow again a solution-focused direction. By asking them what was the hardest thing, it zeroes in on what was most meaningful and important to them. This helps with meaningful reparative solutions. The last question brings attention to what they need and what they look like. This is based on research around victimology, where the needs for answers, apologies, validation, reassurance of safety, reparations and restitution, and the expression of intense emotions are given the opportunity to be voiced by the person harmed. Ask yourself, what would you need or want if or when you were a victim? The Restorative Conference, which is the last stage in the continuum, is formal and offered as part of the youth justice proceedings. It requires all parties to consent and agree to participate in the process. It's not coercive. Prepares all participants prior to a conference. It cannot use anything said during the conference against the offender in court. It consistently uses a set of questions, a script, and a structured sequence of speaking that then demonstrates a fair process. It also asks everyone to speak to the harm-related events, impacts, and needs with the fundamental goal of developing an action plan that repairs, restores, and in some cases is transformative. Both as part of the Youth Criminal Justice Act and as reflected in the Continuum of Restorative Practices, conferences have a designated role. Under the legislation, they can be employed as extrajudicial measures prior to formal court-related proceedings, or as an extrajudicial sanction coming out of the courts. The challenge is to find both police jurisdictions and court operations that embody this as a fulsome practice. All parties, police, judges, Crown attorneys, and defense attorneys need to be aware of restorative conferences as an option. In addition, on the practice side, there needs to be agencies and personnel capable of implementing this option. In some cases, for Canada, there are good examples where the practices exist and can be emulated for other regions, such as Nova Scotia, places in BC, in Ontario, the John Howard Society in Hamilton. However, this is a considerable area for development and advocacy on the part of youth workers to ensure this practice and legal option is available to all youth. Restorative conversations follows a trajectory that are anchored in our basic emotional makeup. This is called affect theory. The core idea behind affect theory, which is called the central blueprint, or as I like to refer to it as the Bobby McFerrin affect, has to do with 4 elements. So think of his song, Don't Worry, Be Happy, and then reverse the title. First of all, be happy, which means have and express positive affect or feelings. Point 2, have less negative affect or feelings. Point 3, if you have negative affects or feelings, express them. Point 4, do more of all of 1, 2, and 3. So in restorative conversations, the questions lead people to their most intense feelings, which are given expression. As the conversations unfold, the actions of others, which are humanized through real encounters, supports the increase of empathy and understanding, which then, in many cases, leads to the presence of more positive feelings and relief. This is a central blueprint in action and also for communities. Central consideration when working with youth and others is the presence of shame. What happens when they've been dissed and disrespected? This is an important aspect of affect theory. The compass of shame shows how we react to being shamed. Everyone tries to cope with shame and shaming because it is often experienced as an attack on our fundamental sense of self. I'm ashamed of you. The conventional justice system evokes much shaming through blaming. This does not motivate anyone to make changes in their behavior. In fact, what it often does is contribute to youth finding themselves on one of the points of this compass as a way of coping with what they experience as attacks on themselves and damage to their self-esteem. Attacking others before being attacked is one defense. However, others take it out on themselves and attack their own self in any number of self-destructive ways. Others cope by simply avoiding or denying when they are being confronted with their actions. Restorative conversations and conferences acknowledge the presence of shame, but aim to reintegrate the young person at various points, both in the conference itself and as part of the solution. This goes back to the nature of the questions used in a conference or restorative conversations. None of them aim at shaming or blaming the person who has caused the harm or the person who has been harmed. I want to highlight some caveats and considerations if we want to see restorative justice scale up and become system-wide. So, if restorative justice is simply added onto the existing justice system without thorough reform, using a restorative lens, from policing to the courts, then the scope, the intent, and the integrity of restorative justice will be diluted and actually perverted. The lens through which harm doing is seen provides only an individual definition of actions and is not contextualized or linked to root causes. Solutions will not be long-lasting or generalizable. Restorative justice is not spread across all domains that impact on child and youth lives, then positive efforts in one area can be nullified by the damaging effects of other systems and dynamics, such as push out from school, limited community opportunity, the effects of poverty, marginalization through racism, and other forms of isms. And if restorative justice is implemented without adherence to standards of practice, quality, and effectiveness will be severely limited. The last points are directed to youth workers in their work with youth. First of all, restorative justice is a meaningful and available option for youth within the criminal justice system and school discipline processes. But youth workers need to advocate on behalf of youth for the use of this as an option. Restorative justice is consistent with what we know of youth development and the maturing brain. It provides the opportunity for youth who've caused harm to repair the harm, restore their own dignity, and repair and restore damaged relationships. It equally provides the opportunity for youth who've been the victim of harm to have a real voice in speaking to the impacts of events and their needs. And lastly, and also equally important, it is a pathway that challenges the pipeline to prison dynamic and thus leads to real change.
Hello, everyone. As Rebecca mentioned earlier, my name is Zainab Godwin, and I'm a Youth Justice Manager at For Youth Initiative. Just a quick recap about, or quick information about For Youth Initiative. For Youth Initiative is a nonprofit organization that provides programs and services to young people living in low-income neighborhoods in Toronto. FY identifies itself as a youth-led, youth-driven, and youth-focused agency that recognizes the importance of involving local youth in the development of programs and is committed to developing leadership capacities among young people. Our vision is to create healthy communities where youth are fully engaged and equal participants in society. And our mission is to reduce violence and build youth leadership in our community by increasing access to opportunities for marginalized youth. To talk about our youth justice program, which is now called R.I.S.E, Reintegrating the Socially Excluded, it's important that I give a quick backstory on how R.I.S.E started. R.I.S.E was initially called BLOC, Building Lives on Community Cohesion. It was a pilot that ran between the years of 2012 to 2014. It was a community-based project that focused on providing capacity and social supports for youth in conflict with the law. And out of that program came intervention strategies to effectively support these young people. And it was not an intervention strategy that came from academic research or just the knowledge of people who've worked with youth in conflict with the law. It came directly from young people who have walked this path. Some of the barriers that they identified to reintegrating into communities were the negative encounters that they had with police. Police were unfairly targeting them in their neighborhoods. This was when carding was very prominent. And another barrier that they listed was lack of mentors. A lot of the young people, young men especially, who found themselves in conflict with the law realized that they didn't have access to mentors. They didn't have access to role models in their communities that were positive role models that they can look up to walk a straight path. And the third barrier that they outlined was the anti-Black racism. Racism in general was one of the issues that Black males especially noted that they faced in their community, in society. They expressed that the look of their skin was an issue that they constantly had to battle everywhere they went, within and outside their immediate community. So out of those intervention strategies came our R.I.S.E program. Now, what was added onto these intervention strategies, or these barriers, sorry, that we noted, was the lack of educational support and lack of employment opportunities that these young people also went through. So the R.I.S.E model was developed to provide wraparound supports to youth between the ages of 12 to 17 who are in conflict with the law, and it had four focus areas, or four outcome areas, that were work and career or employment, education, family well-being, and social life or social inclusion. Now, the R.I.S.E model provides full wraparound supports that focuses on the individual goals that the young people set. The program did not, or the program staff or the case managers will never impose goals on the young people. We're a firm believer, and this is again where our identification as a youth-led and youth-driven organization comes into play, that we know that young people, no matter their age, are aware of what they want as an individual, and it is our duty to give them the platform to express their wants, their desires, and their goals. So using that, that knowledge and that mindset, we allow them to be co-creators, or at least creators of their own goals, and we act as a supporting system to help them achieve these goals. So we provide case managers who work with these young people to achieve their goals. They meet bi-weekly for one-on-one session with their case manager and go over the goals that they've outlined and their progress to date, and barriers that they're encountering, and we support them to work through these barriers and to overcome them. Additionally, we, as an organization, we offer many different programs to not just youth in conflict with the law, but to newcomer youth, Canadian-born youth, any and every young person that needs support. We have leadership programs and recreational programs and general support for any of our young people, and we don't believe in the concept of isolating young people in conflict with the law and separating them as a separate population from all the other youth we work with. So we incorporate them into everything we do. They participate in all of the programs that we offer, in our youth leadership programs, in our studio program, cooking, any other recreational program. They utilize our studio, art programs, all of our youth leadership ambassador programs, the ones that we've partnered with YouthRex also for the noise program. They participate in every and anything, and a lot of that comes back to the outcomes that we outlined in the R.I.S.E program. It's to increase their social life and ensure that they're positively socially included in their society. And the For Youth Initiative is one of their home-based societies, and it's important for us that they are incorporated in all the different programs, and they don't feel like they are a separate population amongst the rest of our youth. And also ensuring that they achieve their education and employment outcomes, we partner with other organizations who support these goals. We don't want to be an expert in everything. We know where we're strong and we know where we need support. So employment and educational supports are some of the areas that we know it's not our forte, and we don't pretend to have it be our forte. So we partner with employment agencies like Youth Employment Services, St. Stephen's Community House, and any other Employment Ontario agencies that provide the supports that we know are inclusive. We create those partnerships to better support the youth we work with. Now to restorative justice practices. Now, restorative justice practices were introduced to our organization through the Youth Justice Program. However, it is now being practiced throughout the organization with all of our youth in all of the spaces. The two types of restorative justice practices that we utilize are formal circles and informal circles. The formal circles are usually done in collaboration with the local police station 12 Division and apply only to youth justice clients either as a pre-charge or post-charge step. The community police liaison chair at 12 Division generally facilitates most of the court or police related circles, and as an organization we step in to offer support to the youth and their families because that's an important part of the circle. it's important that whether victim or offender, you have a network of support system, and we come in to offer that support to the young people. The informal circles we use almost religiously to resolve conflicts and ensure longer lasting relationships with all of the youth in our organization. And I'll give examples of how we've used them in the past. The formal circles, or generally pre-charge, at least that's the example that I'll be giving. So a couple of years ago, or maybe last year, a young person was brought to our organization, and he was brought by his dad because his dad figured he was in trouble with the police. He just got arrested, and they needed support. So in conversation with this young person, we realized that he had robbed someone of a $20 bill and went home like nothing happened. And the police, of course, came to his door a few hours later and arrested him in the presence of his mom, who was also a newcomer to the country and barely spoke English. So she was distraught, she was lost, she was confused, because she didn't really know, she didn't fully understand what was happening. All she knew was that her only child was being arrested and taken away by the police. So we spoke to the police station with the permission of the parents, of course, and offered to resolve this issue through Restorative Justice Circle. And the reason behind that was because both boys went to the same school, and their older brothers, one older brother and one older cousin were friends. So it's not two completely unrelated people. They've known each other. They're from the same communities, and it's not something that is that should be resolved in court. It's not something that could be easily resolved in court. At least we don't think the outcomes in court would be that meaningful to the young people or to their parents. So the police agreed to do a restorative justice circle, and thankfully they did that, because what was realized in the circle was that the reason why this young man stole the $20 from the other kid was because earlier in the week the other kid had said some really foul things about his mother, and he had great respect for his mom and loves her deeply and dearly, and he was very offended by that and didn't want to fight, at least not on school property, because he feared getting suspended, because again, he didn't want it to come back to his mom. He didn't want his mom to find out. So he figured the easiest way to get back to this kid is to rob him and rough him up a bit on the streets where nobody's there as witness. What he didn't realize was that this would then lead to an arrest. But what was interesting about this circle was that the other young person who was throughout this process felt like he was the victim and he was wronged, and his rights had been violated, and he was in his right to feel that way. But through the circle, he realized that he too was a culprit of this, and he too had offended someone. And it was not just the person in front of him, it was his family who he didn't see. And that was really important, because it's important for them to see that the words you say or the actions you take do not only affect one person, it affects so many other people. And when they see that, it's so much easier for them to make the right decision going forward, knowing that I may be harming so many more people than this one person in front of me. There's a thought process that comes into play once young people have participated in a restorative justice circle, because now they're aware of all the other parts that are generally invisible within that situation. So that was resolved successfully. Now the challenges with formal restorative justice circle that we've noticed is getting the buy-in of all parties involved is very difficult, especially when youth feel like they are hands down definitely the victim. They generally would not want to participate in a restorative justice circle, because the idea is that this other person needs to pay, and the only way they should pay is through the law, through the courts. They need to be fined or charged for this, and a lot of that has to do with the lack of understanding of the potential outcomes of restorative justice circles, and understanding that it goes beyond having someone charged and having their name in the police records for a number of years. It's touching that young person at their core and giving them that understanding that their actions are bigger than they think it is. And generally, young people are very quick to think and do. There's no long thought process that goes into a lot of what they do, but this practice pushes them to think a little bit harder, think a little bit more, think outside of the box that they're used to thinking within. So I've found it very successful in using restorative justice circles as opposed to charging young people through the courts and having them do jail time. Informal circles, we no longer call them circles at our organization because, we no longer call them restorative justice circles. We just call them circles at our organization because it's no longer, mainly because we feel the term restorative justice is very court-related and it's a legal thing a bit. But when you're using it in an informal manner, especially for people who've never been in conflict with the law, it's scary for them to think, oh, I'm doing a restorative justice circle. So we just call it a circle, and it has been so effective at our organization that we've had youth calling a circle on us as staff, or calling a circle on each other, and that for us is a testament to the success of the circle, that they themselves are able to see how it works and how they can apply it. We've used it for peer-to-peer conflict resolution. We've used it for staff-to-youth conflict resolution. And an example I can give about this was about maybe 6 months or so ago, there were a group of young women who were all friends. And as things happen with teenage girls, one thing was said that led to other things, and that group separated into two groups. And those two groups started going at each other on social media, talking about each other in school, to the point where they were planning on fighting. Now, because a lot of them come to FYI, we were made aware of the situation. We noticed right away that something wasn't right, and we wanted to step in and prevent it getting worse. So this is where also restorative practices can be used as a preventative measure. We knew there was a fight coming up, and we wanted to prevent it getting there. So we offered to do a circle. It was, of course, difficult to get everyone to participate, but because of the relationship we've built with them over the years, it made things a lot easier to have them understand that, no, we're not asking you to come in here and hug it out. We're asking you to actually come in here and say what you have to say in a safe space, but have your voice heard. Because the whole idea behind the fight is you want someone to hear you. You want them to understand why you're upset. So let's do it. Let's hear each other out. So we had the circle, and it was a really, that was one of my first informal circles that I sat in, and it was a heartfelt moment, because at the end of the circle, they were all in tears and hugging each other and apologizing to each other because they realized it all stemmed from one text that was misunderstood. And it was not that big of a deal, but everything else that played a part into it, all the other parties that were not even involved in this text message and gave their own interpretation of it, played a part in creating this bigger than it needed to be conflict. But through the circle, we were able to resolve the issue in a more civil manner. No fight happened, so that was a preventative step that was taken. Everyone's voice was heard. Everyone in that circle, no one person was a victim and no one person was an offender. Everyone played an equal part in it, so they all understood that and were able to take ownership of the roles that they played. And it was beautiful to see them all come back together without a fight needing to happen. Another way that we've incorporated restorative justice practices at our organization is taking away our banning rules. In the past, when young people do things like offend a staff verbally or abuse a staff, verbally or even physically, our rules had stated that you'll be banned for a certain number of days, and when you return, you'll have a probation period. So that was those were our steps to resolving conflicts. But now we've incorporated restorative practices into those, and how we resolve it is first doing a circle and having this young person understand the impact of their action. For example, a young person would say some foul things to a staff, thinking, "Oh, you're a staff, you work here. I have a right to say whatever I want to you." But what they don't realize is that the staff is a person with a family, with loved ones, and the things you say to them are things that they take on and bring home with them, and end up taking it out on people who are not even who had nothing to do with the situation, and it trickles on and it affects so many more people. So for us, it was important for them to see that the things you say here and now does not only affect the people who are in front of you, it plays a much larger role in the lives of people that are around than you can even conceptualize. So it was it's an important piece in how we support youth and ensure that they don't get kicked out of the organization and left out on the street. So I'm not sure if, so I guess it's a preventative measure in that sense as well, but generally it happens after the incident has occurred. But instead of kicking them out or banning them, we use this measure to ensure that they understand what's being done, they take ownership of it, and they learn from that experience and don't repeat it. Now, our use of restorative justice practices has also taught us that whether harm is being done or not, the voices of young people should always be heard directly from them and not interpreted by adults. And as adults, we have a tendency to step in and say what we think young people want and say what we think young people should be doing, because we've had the experience of being a young person who's grown into an adult, and that generally, I guess, gives us the right to believe that we know what they want, but every individual person has a right to say what they want and to be an equal player in the creation of their goals and their desires. So we developed the Rising Researchers. And the Rising Researchers is a youth-led research project with 15 newcomers and newcomer youth or first generation Canadian youth. And what they're working on is assessing and identifying systemic and individual barriers that propel their involvement in the criminal justice system. And a lot of this came from us assessing our R.I.S.E program and realizing that there's a higher than usual number of newcomer youth every year throughout the program. And research also shows that there's a higher number of newcomer youth, or at least racialized newcomers in the judicial system. And we wanted to have a better understanding of how, as an organization, but also as a system, the immigration system and the criminal justice system, how can newcomer youth be better supported to ensure that they don't end up in these paths. And coming into the country as a youth, it's an intricate part of their journey that it's an ideal time to support them and change their trajectory if we can. And the only way we'll be able to do that is if they're able to let us know what played a part in them being involved in the criminal justice system and how could that have been prevented. And then using those intervention strategies to support other newcomer youth who may or may not be at risk of falling down similar path. So our Rising Researchers program has been going on since late last year, and the youth are on the verge of completing their report. They've done the research, they're working on the analysis right now, and they'll be putting together the report. And once the report is ready, they'll be ready to launch it, and it's a full youth-led and youth-focused report on how to support newcomer youth and newcomer and first-generation Canadian youth through the integration process to ensure that they do not end up in the criminal justice system. The report will be released on May 31st, and we'll have a report launch event at 1652 Keele Street. That is our site. And it will be from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. If you want more information or would like to have the report emailed to you, perhaps it's something you could use at your organization as well, please feel free to send me an email at zainab@foryouth.ca. It's on the screen. I'll be happy to provide any more information I can. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Zainab. Okay, I'm going to bring Rick back, and we'll have a chance to ask some questions. Just a second. Where? Anita? I can't move it.
Oh, Rick's back, but he's not.
I can't.
I was upside down. Well, you were muted, so maybe repeat that.
So Rick is back, and thank you so much, Zainab, for that overview of your work. I'd like to invite any of our guests to ask questions now. If you can think of any questions that you have for either Rick or Zainab. One has come in for Rick, and someone is wondering if you have any top tips for getting started with restorative practices with youth.
Sure. Well, first of all, the workers need to be trained in the model and be kind of feeling comfortable with it, so that they can explain both what it is, but why it works, because that's part of the big piece, which is getting buy-in. So you have to be sort of sold on it yourself and understand why it works and that. And then if it's for youth, I find that youth and young people, they take to this almost like a duck in water. Once they get into it, because they realize that it's for them, it's about their voice, it's about what's real. I think they're really tuned into social justice issues. So I think, when you sort of present it to youth, you can create a lot of young leaders who can be your champions.
Zainab, is there anything you want to add? Any tips you have for other organizations maybe starting out?
I definitely agree with Rick. What was very important for us was ensuring that all of our staff were trained in restorative justice practices. And in addition to that, it's as much as it's important to get the buy-in of the participants in the circle, it's important to get the buy-in of the staff to understand that it's an important process. It's not just a slap on the wrist. It's something that goes and touches the core of a young person. So having that understanding shared among the staff is that's one of the first two steps that I will suggest as a starting point.
Thanks. There's a question specifically to you, Zainab, if you happen to know any services in Kitchener, Waterloo, or Cambridge that are similar to the R.I.S.E program?
Off the top of my head, I don't know any specific organization, but what we've done in the last few months is we've compiled a list of organizations who offer very similar programs to ours in Canada, but mainly in Ontario. If you would like to send us an email, or send me an email, sorry, zainab@foryouth.ca, I can share that list with you, and on that list it also explains how our programs are similar or different, so you'll be able to see a list of other organizations that offer something similar.
Rick, do you know of anything?
Yeah, actually, Kitchener-Waterloo is probably one of the larger areas where there's all sorts of restorative activity going on. They really took hold of this in the 70s. So Community Justice Initiatives is a center there. So if you contacted them, or if you want to forward an email to me, maybe through you, Rebecca, I can give them some contact info. But they're a real hotbed of activity out there.
Thanks so much. Another question, Rick, maybe you can answer, is youth involved in gangs, formal or informally, and having substance abuse addictions. Should restorative practices be appropriate?
Definitely. And the reason I would say that is because the restorative model doesn't use labels. So just because someone's involved in a gang or because someone's involved in substances, that's not a reason why they shouldn't be given this opportunity. And in terms of gang-focused work, I know I worked with my Regent Park initiative a few years ago who were dealing with gang-involved youth and that, and they brought this into their program mix. And what they were looking at was, once again, to build leaders amongst the youth who can be the champions of that. So it does work. You have to, build over time because you have to create another sort of set of, values and ethics amongst the youth, but I believe that many youth at their core want to be the best that they can be. A lot of times they get trapped in other situations that make it difficult for that to happen. So I would say definitely yes.
I'd like to add on that. I agree 100% with Rick that the beautiful thing about restorative justice practices is it doesn't label you into any of these categories. But as an organization who've worked with gang-involved youth and substance abuse individuals, or substance abuse, related individuals, what we've been able to do is support all these different issues together, but in an isolated manner at the same time, and I'll explain what I mean. The Restorative Justice Circle is used to resolve the harm that is being done, and the harm could have been caused by their use of substances. It could have been caused by pressure from their gang. But we're supporting that through the individual one-on-one support sessions. It's not being dealt with in the circle. If they need support with substance abuse, we support that individually, one-on-one, to make sure that the circle is not about their substance issue. It's not about their gang involvement. It is simply about the issue that brought them here, whatever crime was committed or whatever harm was done. So dealing with those things together, but in an isolated manner at the same time, is important. It's a really delicate place to be, but if it's done right, it will support them to leave the gang involvement, and it would also support their withdrawal from substance abuse.
Thanks so much. It makes me think about how important recognition and belonging is to the process and also to those other issues that were named. Another question is it easier to get buy-in for involvement in restorative practices for young people who have been involved in minor crimes than more serious crimes? Rick, do you have any?
Well, the research actually shows that restorative practices, you get more buy-in where there's actually the more serious crimes. So it's kind of counterintuitive, we kind of think. But I think, one of the reasons behind it is because those sorts of things are very real. When it has to do with like property or, vandalism or thefts, then it's easy to sort of minimize the impacts. But when it has to do with real harms between people, then people really feel it. And, the restorative approach is very much about the emotional life that we have in that. So there's real intensity, but once again, you would need to work that through over time with both participants, the person that caused the harm, as well as the person that, was harmed in that. But there's lots of demonstrations of where it's been incredibly powerful, where there's been serious, and I mean, where there's been deaths involved, and it's had an amazing impact on all parties.
Yeah, I think what I would also add to that is that with the more serious offenses, the impact is it's felt a lot more. It touches people a lot more. It's deeper, so it's more effective when it's more serious.
Thanks. Another person is asking, are there any tips to get buy-in from the courts, the police, etc., to encourage them to refer young people to a restorative program? Do you want to start, Zainab?
Sure. What our experience has been, it's really difficult to get people from the police and the courts to get to buy into the restorative justice practice because, and again, it has a lot to do with what you've learned for so long is what you know, and it's difficult for people to change their mindset on what they consider new things, even though restorative justice practices is far from new. But what we've been able to do and how we've been able to succeed is, instead of trying to approach the entire court system or trying to approach Toronto Police Services, we've gone to our local police division and had that conversation with them. And it was a lot easier for us because the community police liaison chair at that division already knew restorative justice practices and was already training people on it. So it's a lot easier, but it would also be easier for anyone to approach your local police station and create a partnership with them first and work your way through that. And targeting the individual police themselves as opposed to trying to attack or target the entire bureaucracy of it would make life a lot easier, and you would see a more immediate change than trying to get the change through the police, Toronto Police Service.
Do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, the three things that I would say. One is have stories, make it real. So that can be stories from individual youth, or if you're dealing with, officials, if they've got stories in their life, they can be very compelling to people. The second thing would be have data. There's a lot of research that shows that this is a model that stops young people from reoffending. And the other piece of the data would be to do sort of cost-benefit analysis. When you look at using restorative approaches versus using policing and the courts and custody, this is incredibly cheaper. So there's a real cost savings involved. The last thing would be have champions. What I would find is either judges or lawyers who know this model, who can speak to their peers. A lot of times lawyers and court officials won't necessarily listen to other professionals, but if you can find, and there are some in Toronto, certainly in Nova Scotia, Jennifer Llewellyn is an international figure. These are people that can really speak to the legalistic case for this. So those are the three things that I would suggest.
Thanks. This is the last question. We're almost at the hour, and it's a related question about changing the system to recognize restorative practices. So one person is asking if these approaches are supported by the ministry and if they'll be expanded. As counselors who work with youth mandated for counseling, we would love to be incorporated. We would love to incorporate this ideology.
Well, in terms of the ministry, I think it's on paper. The big challenge is in practice what happens. So what you have is, great programs like R.I.S.E that demonstrate, how effective this is, but it's not funded across the system. So there's an opportunity because it's on paper, it's in the legislation, but what needs to happen is that, politicians and policymakers need to get behind this because I think it represents a real alternative to large numbers of youth that are being marginalized for other reasons other than crime-related issues.
Yeah, and as a counselor, if you're able to incorporate this into your practices, I think it helps with the numbers and developing the stats to show that there are many different ways that restorative justice practices can be utilized, and it was shown an array of benefits to it. So I would definitely say if you're able to incorporate it into your practices, by all means.
Okay, thank you both to Rick and Zainab. To everyone who joined us, thank you so much. You can stay in touch with Rick. He's quite active on Twitter. I'll give you his Twitter handle here just a second.
R. Kelly at 123.
Okay, Rick can do it. Thank you. And stay tuned for the Rising Researchers Report. We'll make some noise about it here at YouthRex and learn more about restorative practices. So thank you again to everybody for joining us in this really important conversation. And a couple of notes. Sorry, I need to remember there are a couple more slides here. Check out the exchange. We have more resources online about restorative justice. If you know of any that should be shared, please, by all means, share them with us, and mobilize them. And then finally, just a heads up, I hope that everyone is signed up to our newsletter, because our next webinar, we're still working out the date, but it is going to be focused on supporting immigrant and newcomer youth. So thanks again to everyone, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.